Local 514's host, Savannah Craig, interviewed Shannon Lloyd on whether we can tree plant our way out of climate change. Lloyd and Craig discussed the legitimacy of Montreal's plan to be carbon neutral by 2030. They also discussed companies promoting tree planting to balance carbon emissions.
Shannon, could you please just state your name and your position at Concordia?
Sure. My name is Shannon Lloyd, and I'm Associate Professor of Management in the John Wilson School of Business.
Wonderful, thank you. So as I shared with you before, Montreal is planning to plant 500,000 trees and commit to reducing carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. Do you have any initial thoughts or reactions to this?
Sure. So I will be very honest. I'm not that familiar with Montreal's plan. I really focus on corporate efforts on more of a global scale. So I really can't add much about Montreal's plan. I guess the questions I might have are whether or not they're going to the tree planting is going to be used in a way to offset or claim offsets, I should say, towards emissions that are actually resulting from activities in Montreal, or if that is in addition to reducing emissions. And I think that's the big question that has to be looked at is how many, what amount of emissions will actually be reduced.
So thank you for bringing up. I think that that's a good thing to analyze. I know with Montreal, they don't specifically focus on the kind of reduction of emissions. It's more for island cooling. But I guess it kind of this brings me to my next question, which is when I've been piecing together this story, I've been kind of focusing on, not just Montreal, like as a society, how do we kind of view tree planting and addressing climate change? And I have come across a few times businesses that I've had this promo, such as, if you buy from us or buy this much, we'll plant this many trees. And we're doing this to kind of offset our emissions or benefit us to prevent climate change. What do you think of this kind of model capitalism where it's encouraging and influencing buying in place of we'll help the environment by planting this many trees?
Yeah, so I mean I have mixed thoughts about it. So I think I don't want to indicate that I don't think we should be planting trees, because I 100% think we should be planting more trees. And I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of reasons, not just the ability to uptake carbon, but also to reduce other forms of pollution, to provide cooling. I mean, it's definitely a question of social justice. And we look around the neighborhoods, where do we see trees? It's tends to be the more affluent neighborhoods. And so there's many issues surrounding trees and many good reasons to plant trees. And so I don't want to give the impression that I'm opposed to planting trees, because that's absolutely not the case. But in terms of from a corporate perspective, I think we need more direct action. I think more direct action is critical, because for a variety of reasons. One is that my research group previously looked at the use of renewable energy certificates, not the same as offsets, but in some ways similar. So, essentially companies purchasing the right to claim the use of renewable energy when they're actually using electricity from the grid, for example, and don't have control over the mix. And they basically are using whatever mix is available to them through the grid. There's been several studies that have been done to look at this process. And so there's not a robust regulatory framework for determining, well, which RECs are sufficient and which ones aren't. And so there's been a number of studies that have been done that have shown that the purchase of RECs don't actually, the idea is that there's this change that occurs from this procurement in which the market generates more renewable energy, and then we ultimately get fewer emissions. And that's just not been shown to be the case. And so what we call this is additionality. Do we see additional emission reductions? And generally, no, we don't. There's probably very few a very small percentage of the renewable energy certificates that actually lead to changes in the electricity mix. So generally no. And these actions are voluntary, right? They're not regulated. And so, companies can make a lot of claims, and everybody that's following the issues with renewable energy certificates as well as carbon offsets. The evidence is becoming more and more clear that many of these don't actually lead to emission reductions. And so, I think this is the big issue. This is indirect action that's not regulated. We just sort of generally accepted that, we can do these things and they will lead to emission reductions. And now the evidence is showing that they generally don't. And so I think that these things, again, we should be doing a lot of these things. We should be generating more renewable energy. We should be planting trees. We should be doing these various things that are covered by carbon offsets. But I don't think we should be giving those who didn't directly take those actions credit, unless we can come up with a more robust framework for determining which ones do actually lead to reductions.
I don't know a ton about the renewable energy certificates. But could you fill me in a little bit about, how long certain, I guess, when it's kind of increased in popularity for businesses to offer this, or where it's often occurring?
Yeah, so goodness, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have numbers in terms of uptake of renewable energy certificates, but we had a study a few years ago where we looked at companies that had set science-based targets and for scope 2 emissions, which is from purchased energy, and we looked at the ways in which they were reducing or claiming that their emissions had been reduced, and identifying where, how they did that. Was it from actual reductions in their energy consumption? Was it from the use of renewable energy certificates? Did they purchase power purchase agreements? What did they do? And so what we estimated for, and I'm going to say a number, and I hope it's correct. It's been a while since we did the study, but I think they were overestimating their emission reductions from scope 2 emissions by about 40% based on the use of renewable energy certificates.
Okay, thank you. And I know that you kind of answered this a little bit, but I still want to just ask, can we tree plant our way out of climate change, or promise renewable energy to kind of combat climate change while continuing in a system of consumption?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suspect there's studies that show have mixed results in terms of answering this question. And I think it depends on what your assumptions are. How many trees can we realistically plant? How many trees will realistically burn from forest fires? You have to make sort of these assumptions when you build these models to try to understand how far can we get from, one action like planting trees, or another action in terms of investing in renewable energy. And certainly we're seeing a huge increase in investments in renewable energy, and a big investment in terms of, electrification. So certainly there must be a bunch of models out there that estimate where we can get. I don't do research in that area, and I can't speak very specifically about what they're estimating, but I think, I guess a couple thoughts. One is that we're still having this conversation. Can we, mitigate warming? And the answer to that question is absolutely not. Like, we've already warmed the planet quite a bit. So certainly we cannot plant our way out of this because we're already in it. We've already made choices. We've already decided that warming is okay. And to what extent, I'm not sure yet, because we're still on the trajectory of warming. So I think the jury's still out as to where we're going to end up. And I think that, the critical thing to remember is that by making this choice, we as a global society have already moved towards a warmer planet. And we are already seeing the consequences of that. And the consequences are harm. I mean, there's been increased deaths from extreme temperatures this summer. We're seeing them all over the place. From extreme events, flooding, and droughts and hurricanes. And so we've already made the choice. And the question is, how bad are we going to let it get? And it could be, anywhere from where we are now to total collapse, ecological collapse. And so I think we can't plant a tree way out of this. We're already in it. But we can systematically take a lot of different actions to, mitigate additional warming. And certainly, planting trees is one thing that we should do and is an important thing, but there are many others. And I think, we have to, and we are, like I said, investing increasingly in more renewable energy and electrification. But I think the question that you're getting at, which is really important, is can we rely on this technological fix to get us there without changing our lifestyles? And I think that's a really critically important question that we need to think very hard about. I think that there's some serious study work going on looking at degrowth. There have been some sessions in Europe to look at degrowth more critically. I think that we need to really be, for example, electrification. We can electrify everything, but if we don't reduce our energy consumption, we can't. If we continue to electrify things here, for example, in Quebec, we're going to use more electricity, and from my understanding, we're at the point where there's not a lot more hydropower that can be extracted, and so we're going to have to look at other options. And are we going to put up more wind turbines? Are we going to install nuclear power? And every time we add, we add more demand to the grid here in Quebec, power that's being sold to maybe another area that relies more heavily on fossil fuels, perhaps they're going to have to rely more heavily on fossil fuels. So the system is really complex. And so I think that, we have to look at sort of all these different facets if we're actually going to mitigate warming anymore.
Thank you so much for your response.
Yeah.
In terms of what you were discussing about we can't reduce climate change or address global warming without changing our lifestyles, do we almost have to kind of, how do I ask this? Can we prevent current climate disaster in a model of capitalism that we live in right now?
Yeah, I don't know. No, I don't think we can with, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I don't think we can further mitigate climate change in the current economic system. I don't think the current economic system can sufficiently limit warming, but that's certainly subjective based on what I think is sufficient. And I think that's part of the issue too, is we really clearly don't agree on, collectively as what is sufficient, like how many people are going to die, which regions are going to be become uninhabitable. And I certainly think that we clearly don't agree on that. And yeah, so how much we need to change our economic system sort of depends on how we answer that question.
I'm really glad you said that. So I feel like when just looking at climate change coverage and just looking at, governments meeting to talk about this, and they come to a certain agreement, and then when it comes to action, no one is doing what they say.
It's really, this is a really, they use this term wicked problem, right? We've heard this term, and that's what it is. And so, in the developed world, what are we willing to give up? and acknowledging that much of the world doesn't live like we do, doesn't have the same access to things that we have access to. And coincidentally, they're the ones that are going to suffer the most, generally speaking. And so, yeah, I think it's really difficult because mitigating warming will require certainly technological innovation, which is where our focus, I think, has primarily been. But I think also, you know, changes in our economic system and in potentially the way we live our lives.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to get into your research a little bit more and what you've studied. I know that you've studied the misalignment of corporate environmental performance with collective environmental goals. Could you tell me a little bit more about
Sure.
this, and possibly in the context of Quebec or Montreal?
Yeah, so again, my focus tends to be more at a global level, looking more at multinationals. And so, we did mention the use of renewable energy certificates to claim the use of renewable electricity and therefore claim lower emissions, which is certainly not aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, for example. Other examples would be the use of intensity-based targets. So, we're going to reduce the amount of emissions per unit output from our company, but at the same time increase the output. And so, while your emission intensity might look better, the overall amount of emissions may increase. So that would also lead to a misalignment. Certainly, I've also focused a bit on scope 3 emissions. And so I think that's something also that I don't know the extent to which Montreal is considering scope 3 emissions, but these are, emissions from the things that we purchase. So the indirect emissions. So if we buy products that come from somewhere outside of Montreal, which most of the products that we buy most likely come from outside of Montreal or from outside of Quebec or even outside of Canada, there's emissions occurring elsewhere. And so the question is, who's responsible for those emissions? Is it the consumers or is it the producers? Or is it both? And how do we target initiatives to reduce those emissions? And that's really challenging because there's not a lot of transparency in supply chains. And so companies often have much less transparency about their supply chains than we realize, especially if they're buying commodity products that could be produced all over the place. And so identifying where their emissions are occurring is challenging. We can certainly estimate supply chain emissions, reasonably, but identifying, where specifically they're generated and how to go about reducing them is much more challenging. So some of my research is focused on trying to identify ways in which we can help companies target meaningful initiatives to initiatives that ultimately do reduce scope 3 emissions.
I'm not sure if you can answer this, but just in terms of, who's responsible, the consumer or the producer, I do see a lot of conversation kind of based around, it's not really individuals so much. We can carry a reusable water bottle, but at the end of the day, it's companies, producing so much emissions.
Yeah.
Is there kind of a need to refocus the conversation and in looking at the power that consumers hold? That, Nike, for example, produces, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know they're one of the biggest producers of CO2 emissions. If we just stop purchasing from them, does that result in some change?
No, I mean, so I firmly believe that our regulators are failing us. I think corporations have to be regulated. I think if we truly want to reduce emissions, well, then we need to establish regulation that requires companies to reduce emissions. I think consumers have, very little power individually. I guess the only way we would, as consumers or citizens, increase our power is to, take collective action, again, towards either the companies or the regulators to incentivize change. But I think that I'm not advocating for that, but I guess the point just is I don't think individually we have a lot of power. And I also think that the strategies that companies are employing now are very convoluted. And so in order for a consumer to truly compare one company to another company, you have to have a pretty solid understanding of greenhouse gas accounting and understand what goes into greenhouse gas accounting, understand the differences in types of greenhouse gases, understand the strategies that the company is employing, whether or not they are truly reducing their emissions or whether they're claiming lower emissions by using renewable energy certificates, or whether they're claiming lower emissions because of they purchased offsets. And then where did they purchase these offsets? Are these offsets more or less robust? Can I safely assume that, that the offsets that they've claimed are legitimate, or what percentage of those emission offsets are legitimate? And so, it's not just a matter of, trying to influence their actions, but it's the ability to evaluate their actions. And so what we see is a number of researchers and research organizations that are investing time and effort in, creating robust studies, looking at specific actions or specific companies. And what we can see from those studies by and large is that, the current action that's being taken is insufficient. And so I think the best way to, well, maybe I should say the best way, but, historically voluntary actions have not led to sufficient change in a variety of different environmental areas. And in those cases, regulation was needed. And I think probably the same is the case for climate.
I'm sure this might require a long-winded answer, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I just want to get a sense of, what are the main ways that these regulations are failing us? Are there maybe some important ones that
the policy is not my area of research. I think talking to somebody who's working in the policy arena to try to understand what historically has worked in situations like this. Probably, I suspect clear limits are needed, but what format they take, I don't know.
Thank you so much.
I think the big issue is that companies are not incentivized to reduce emissions. Companies are incentivized to sell more product, make more, and generate more revenue. And right now, generating revenue, by and large, results in more emissions. And so I think that the market rules are broken from a climate mitigation perspective.
Thank you for sharing. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like to mention or think that is worthwhile that I look into?
I don't know. I think that these interviews are very challenging because it is a discouraging situation, I think, from a climate perspective right now. And so it's, I think it's important to encourage, and we need sort of like all hands on deck, right? We need to be investing in many different initiatives, technologies, incentives to get individuals and organizations to take action to reduce emissions. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the key thing is that there is no one solution, but we need to be investing in many solutions, many potential solutions. And, you know, yeah, I guess that's it. I think that and I also think that there are organizations and companies that are taking very meaningful action. And so I think that's the other aspect, is that, you know, when talking about voluntary action, it's sort of on a whole, on average. That's not to say that there aren't some organizations that are taking meaningful actions that are reducing emissions or investing in new technologies that have high potential for reducing emissions. And so, yeah, I think that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you and learning more about the situation.
Have you talking to anyone else from Concord, like Carly Zeter, perhaps? Okay, good, because she is, if you're talking trees, and then the other person I would mention is Rebecca Titler.
Oh yeah, I actually know her from when I was a student.
Yeah, because I think she was involved in an initiative, probably with Carly, I don't know, but an initiative to plant trees on campus. And I believe they did a decent bit of research to understand which types of trees should be planted to increase the amount of carbon uptake. So I would also recommend, because she has, you know, her experience sort of more on a project level on campus. But I think anybody that you can talk to that's been engaged in those initiatives to identify, you know, where and what kind of trees to plant, and have probably had challenges with them. And my understanding is that, you know, you have to plant a lot more trees than you're, you know, to get the number of trees that you want for your project to offset or to uptake the amount of carbon that you're trying to uptake. And yeah, so I think I would talk to some of them. And then I think the other suggestion I would have for you is, have you talked to anybody related that's been you know, dealing with issues related to the current forest fires? Because I think that that's something really important to keep in mind too. If we are going to have increased forest fires like this, we need to, you know, factor that into our calculus in terms of thinking about how many trees we need to plant.
I haven't found anyone yet, but I'm still looking because I definitely want to speak about that. And I'm trying to find, which is difficult, but trying to find out how much carbon has been essentially put in the air, you know, from the loss of these trees, this soil. So yeah, definitely want to listen to that. But
yeah, I'm sure there's somebody who's doing those analyses. I think it would be really interesting to talk with them.
Thank you so much. On the policy level, is there anyone that maybe comes to mind?
I will send you some names.
Okay, no rush if it's not too much trouble.
No, we have a couple faculty members who engage in this area. Their names aren't coming to my mind right now, so I'll send you their names and you can reach out to them. And if they're not the right people, they might know others that are working in this area who are.
Absolutely, that would be great if it's not too much trouble.
Not at all.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your help and for your time. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
With you as well.